Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast. We've hit episode 53 now, at least I think it's 53, let me check. Yes, indeed it is. Always got to be sure I'm getting the episode number right. And today we're going to be continuing our talks on the Hibernate framework. More specifically, we're going to be diving back into relationships. Okay, not with your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whatever. We're talking about relationships in databases between tables, and moreover, how we can replicate that inside of our Hibernate code. But before we jump into all that great content, I want to get started with some 5-star reviews. I had a couple that came in. If you're interested in leaving one, I will read your review if it's a 5-star at the top of the next episode. You can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, LOVE, and spread the love, share the love, make everyone feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Looks like we had 2 reviews come in, one from India and one from Norway, which is fantastic. I love it when we get reviews from overseas, okay? We're in North America, or at least I'm in North America. I say we, I don't know why, I mean myself. And a lot of our reviews come in from North America, but I absolutely love it when I get them from the UK or somewhere like Norway or India or Russia or anywhere. I love getting these reviews from overseas, just because it makes me feel like an international man of mystery. Anyway, we get two great reviews, 2 5 stars. First one from Norway, saying this is a great for getting started with Java. They say, thanks for a great podcast. It's easy for a computer science student to follow along with relevant topics that aren't necessarily taught by this person's college university. And they recommend a future podcast topic that they'd be interested in could be Drop Wizard and possibly even a bit on custom token authentication. They say, keep up the good work. Now, I didn't know what Drop Wizard was, so I went and did a quick check on what Drop Wizard is. And it looks like it's for RESTful type framework. So it says Drop Wizard is a Java framework for developing ops-friendly, high-performance RESTful web services. Now, a RESTful web service is essentially something that allows you to invoke a call, sort of like an AJAX call, and call an actual server and be able to have the server do a piece of work, some sort of work carried out, and then return back to you the results of that work, generally in the form of a JSON object. Now, that is definitely something that Spring does, the Spring framework, which I've taught here before. I can't remember if I've touched specifically on RESTful web programming. Of course, my memory fails me at the moment, but that's definitely a topic that if I have not yet talked about, I will definitely be talking about because RESTful web services are where it's at these days. So no worries about that. It looks like Drop Wizard is just a third-party type library that someone put together to sort of make it easy to use web services, but like I said, Spring does it quite nicely. If that is not what you're looking for, the person who left this review, then let me know, and maybe I could look further into Drop Wizard specifically. They also talked about custom token authentication, and again, I'm not exactly sure what they specifically mean by custom authentication tokens, but it sounds like it's something along the lines of Spring security. So again, I'm sticking with the Spring line of products just because you got to keep it in the family type of thing. Of course, I have no ties or associations or affiliates with the Spring people, but I just love their stuff. I use it all the time. It just works for me. I use it in my enterprise applications. It's never failed me, so that's why I go with Spring over and over again, because it seems like they know what they're doing. So Spring Security is definitely something I'm going to be creating a whole tutorial framework around. Spring Security is used to add security to your web applications. And by security, I mean forcing people to be authenticated when they try to get access to your product. So if you've created a web app and they want to try to get into the web app, and let's say they're logging in like you log in on Facebook, it can actually allow you a very easy way to deny them access to all the web pages that you want to have sort of secured behind your, your wall, your authentication wall. So if someone is not able to log in with the correct credentials, they will never have access to any of the pages that you want to have secured from them. But if they log in successfully and if they have the right authentication and the right security roles, then they will be able to see whatever it is that you want them to see. Okay, if that's what this person who left the review was looking for, then Spring Security is definitely a very nice solution and actually quite easy to incorporate into your programming. So hopefully that's what you're looking for. In any case, thank you very much for the review. Now let's hop on over to India, where another review came in. This one, another 5-star review. This person says, never found such a great podcast to learn Java. So it's great. I mean, I love that. I don't know how many Java podcasts there are out there. I'm sure there's a few, but to be called the best, then I'm very humbled by that. So thank you. They say, hi, Trevor. I have a daily commute, 30 kilometers one way to the office. So it takes about 1 hour to get there and 1 hour back. And they said, but thanks to your excellent podcast, I make the best use of my time and keep myself updated with the latest technologies related to my job profile. And they said, I would just request that you never stop recording your podcast because there are so many people like me in the whole world who are eagerly waiting to listen to your next podcast. He says, best wishes and keep up the good work. So thank you. I'm, again, humbled by those wonderful words. Thank you for the kind words. And if you have kind words that you would like to share with me, then by all means, go ahead. You can do it via the howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, LOVE link. Share the love, leave a rating and a review. If you leave a 5-star, I will read it at the top of the next episode. All right. Fantastic. So let's get into the good stuff, the meat and potatoes of this episode. Like I hinted at, we're going to be talking about, obviously, Hibernate, which is what we've been sort of focusing on the past few episodes. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about relationships. So I did a whole bunch of podcasts about this already. I think I did either two or three podcast episodes. When I was talking about databases in SQL, I talked about relationships. So to give you a quick refresher on that topic, it's a relationship is what we use in the database to actually reflect the actual object-oriented relationships that we have in and with our objects when we're doing our Java programming. So you can sort of mimic those relationships in the database by using keys, more specifically foreign keys. So you can have 3 different types of relationships. You can have a one-to-one relationship, a one-to-many relationship, and a many-to-many relationship. Okay? So I think the examples I had used was I said a one-to-one relationship is kind of like when you have a person and a driver's license. So you have like a person table in your database and you have a driver's license table in your database. Typically speaking, at least in North America, one person should only ever be assigned one driver's license number. Okay? One driver's license number and one number only. One person can never have 2 or more driver's license associated to themselves. Okay? That's just not how it works, at least, like I said, in North America. At least as far as I know, in any case. So that's the example I chose, and that can be enforced by a whole bunch of things. I shouldn't say a whole bunch of things. It's enforced by using the foreign keys. Like I said, you have a foreign key that's actually assigned as the primary key of the child table. Now, I don't want to get into all that stuff right now because, like I said, I've already done podcasts on that, so I don't want to repeat myself here. But if you don't know or don't remember specifically what the one-to-one and one-to-many and many-to-many are, perhaps you should go back and re-listen to those episodes before jumping and listening to this one and how we sort of tie those relationships in with Hibernate. All right. So then there's the one-to-many relationship where we have one table that can be associated with many. There's a whole bunch of examples of this, like, let's say, authors and books. Although that's actually not a good example because I think I had that for the many-to-many. What was a good example for one-to-many? Let's say one person can have a history of addresses. Which I guess isn't that great an example either because an address could be assigned to a bunch of different people as well. What the heck example did I use? Let me think about this for a second. Yeah, I can't really remember which one it was that I used, but I thought of another one, and that is the relationship between employer and employee. So basically, you have an employer, which is a company that hires people, and they have a bunch of employees that work for that particular company. That is a great example of a one-to-many relationship. One company hires many employees. Therefore, any given employee, so any person you could point to and say, okay, employee number 1157812, whatever, that employee can only ever map back to one employer, period. They can never be mapped to more than one employer. You see how that works? That's a one-to-many relationship. And that's, a very common type of relationship inside of within databases in general. A lot of them are one-to-many relationships, very common. And the final one is the many-to-many relationship, which is kind of like I hinted at before, which is like authors and books. An author can publish many books, and any one given book can be mapped back to many different authors, right? Because you can have one book that's published by 3 authors, and one of those 3 authors can publish 3 books, or all of those 3 authors can publish 3 different books, but on one of them they just happen to collaborate. So you see how that's a many, one piece of data from the left-hand table could be mapped to many different rows of the right-hand side table, and vice versa. The right-hand side table, any one row could be mapped to many of the rows on the left-hand side table, okay? That's many to many. So these are the 3 types of relationships that you can have within databases. So therefore, that stands to reason that you can somehow create these relationships inside of Hibernate, which is obviously a true statement. There's very much a way to recreate these types of mappings and these types of relationships using Hibernate. All right, so let's talk about them. So this particular subject can be quite lengthy to talk about. So I'm probably going to be spreading this out over a few episodes, but the first one we're going to focus on is probably the most popular relationship, which I hinted at earlier, which is the one-to-many relationship. So how can we go about establishing this relationship inside of our Java objects and our Hibernate framework? Okay, so it really all boils down into being able to properly reflect the relationships in the Java objects. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's focus on the employer-employee situation that I talked about. Okay, employer to employee, one to many. One employer can have many employees, and any one given employee can only be mapped back to one specific employer. Okay, that's the root of the one-to-many relationship. That's exactly how it works. So how can we recreate that in terms of Java objects? Well, let's think about it. If we were to be able to recreate this in Java objects, we would need to establish the relationship inside of the objects themselves. And this is done by embedding the different objects into each of the original objects. And what I mean by that is, think of the employer. So let's say that we have an employer object. Let's keep it dead simple. Let's say the employer only holds two fields, 2 instance variables. One will be the actual ID of the employer, because like I said, with any tables, we need to be able to keep track of a primary key. So we will have an ID field for this, this object, okay? So we'll have an ID field. I'll assign it as a long, because like I explained before, I prefer to use longs over ints because it gives me the opportunity to grow my potential database, or grow my database potentially to be very, very, very large. I'm playing it on the safe side. So I'm going to assign the long ID in as an instance variable, and I'll have the employer name as a string. All right, and then I create my getters and setters appropriately for that object. So it's just a plain old Java object. We've seen this many, many times. We've created this, this very common framework, this very common layout or design for an object where we have our instance variables and our getters and setters. And then we are also going to do the same thing for the employee. So let's keep it simple. Let's have the employee have its own ID. Let's make it a long, and we'll have the employee have its own name. So I'll have an employee name, and that'll be a string, and we'll assign the getters and setters appropriately. All right, so let's say we have those two different objects. Now what? Well, before we really go and dive further into this, we really need to understand the concept of the parent and the child with respect to these relationships. All right, so what is the parent and what is the child when we're referring to these two different objects, okay, the employer and the employee? Well, like I said, it all comes back to the one-to-many type of relationship. So typically in the one-to-many relationship, the child is usually the many side of the relationship. Okay, so like I said, the many side is also the employee side. So that's sort of the child end of our relationship, whereas the parent side of the relationship, clearly I can't talk today, also a great day to be recording a podcast if I can't talk. The parent side of the relationship is the employer, okay? So employer, parent, employee, child, one-to-many. Hopefully I'm saying this over and over again and you guys are getting tired of hearing me say it. That means that you have learned it appropriately and that's a good thing. So we have the parent-child relationship going on. And like I said, why is it one to parent? Why is the other one, particularly the child? Well, typically speaking, when you have a one-to-many, typically the one side is the parent and the many side is the child. Okay, that's generally how I've always seen it. That's generally how it always works. So that's what I'm going to teach you. Now, how do we use this information to go further in creating this relationship? Well, what we do here is what I'm going to teach you is called a unidirectional mapping. So there's actually two different ways to map stuff in Hibernate. Okay, first, this mapping stuff I'm talking about is related to relationships. So we have our three different relationships: one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. Okay, we can sort of picture those on in front of us from left to right: one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. Right now we're talking about the one in the middle, which is one-to-many, and now I'm talking about a concept of unidirectional versus bidirectional. Okay, unidirectional, which infers there's only one direction it can go. Bidirectional, inferring that there's two directions it can go. So the unidirectional and bidirectional concepts apply individually to each relationship. So like I said, we have our three relationships laid out in front of us: one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. And each of those three can have either a unidirectional or a bidirectional relationship. Okay, so if you can kind of map that out in front of you, each one has a unidirectional. So one-to-one has a unidirectional or a bidirectional. One-to-many has a unidirectional or bidirectional. And many-to-many has a unidirectional or a bidirectional type of relationship. Okay, so I guess it's important for me to sort of describe what these concepts really mean. So what is a unidirectional relationship versus a bidirectional relationship? Well, all it really means is that when you're doing your coding, when everything is said and done, if you have a unidirectional relationship, that means that you can only access the relationship, or rather the other side of the relationship, in one direction. Okay, so what that means is, let's say I have created an employee object, and inside of the employee object, I store the employer. Okay, so I'm looking at the child side of the relationship, and I'm specifically talking about the unidirectional type of relationship right now in this given moment. So I look at the child side of the relationship, which is the employee, because that's the many side of the one-to-many. Looking at the child, and inside of that child object, if I were to create it with a unidirectional relationship, I would put in the employer into the child end of the relationship. So what does that mean? Well, that means that when we're using it, that means that we can physically say, let's say we were to instantiate or rather get an employee from the database. We load an employee up and we say, okay, so let's look at this employee. Let's say the employee's name is Trevor Page. Who does Trevor Page work for? Well, if we want to answer that question, we have to say, employee dot get employer. Okay, simple get employer command. I'm just invoking a method call. All right, which is get employer. Now I'm able to invoke that method because it exists. The instance variable exists inside of the employee object because we put it there. Private employer, and then we assign it the variable name we'll just call it employer. Okay, so we have a getter and setter for employer inside of the employee object. All right. Hopefully you're following along with this. I know I'm flip-flopping back and forth with these things, but the whole point of this discussion is to differentiate between unidirectional and bidirectional right now. So I am able to get the employer by invoking the get employer. But now let's flip it around. Let's say we just had an employer object. Okay, so we just have the company object. Now we want to say, okay, what employees work for this particular company, this particular employer? How can we find that out? Well, because we only have a unidirectional relationship going on, there's actually no real way to find out by looking at the employer object, because the employer object, we're not going to be storing the collection of employees that are associated with that particular employer. All right, hopefully you're following along with this. So if I have a unidirectional relationship, that means that I can only go one way to figure out what the corresponding related object is to the original object. So the original object here that I'm talking about is the employee object, and the corresponding relationship to the employee is the employer. All right, so I can only find out who a particular employee works for by looking from the employee object. If I look from the employer object the other way around, I can't find out what employees work, so employees plural, work for that particular single employer. In order to find that out, I need to establish and create a bidirectional relationship. So a bidirectional relationship means you can go either way with the relationship. So that means that not only am I storing which employee works for which employer, but I'm also storing which employees work for which employer. Did I say that correctly? I'm not only storing which... I said that wrong in the first time, I think. I should go back and play it, but I'll say it again just to hopefully say it correctly. With a bidirectional relationship, not only can I find out which employer an employee works for, right, via the employee.getEmployer, but I can also find out which employees, plural, work for which employer, singular. Okay, so I can say employer, I can go to that object and say employer.getEmployees, plural, because there's going to be many employees that work for a single employer. Okay, so bidirectional means that it doesn't matter which of the two objects you have, whether you have an employer object or whether you have an employee object, you can find out what the corresponding relationship is because it's a bidirectional relationship. Okay, again, hopefully you're banging your head against your steering wheel or something, because it's like, for the love of God, Trevor, I understand, please move on. So hopefully if you're saying that, then that means that I've done my job in teaching you this correctly. So unidirectional means you can only go one way, and that is typically from the child to the parent, versus the bidirectional, which means you can go either from the child to the parent or the parent to the child. Does that make sense? That's really what it boils down to if I were to say it in 5 seconds, okay? Good. Fantastic. Great. So because I've just talked about unidirectional versus bidirectional, why, obviously there's a reason why I'm talking about it right now. And the reason is that when you're talking about mapping with Hibernate a unidirectional relationship, it's usually easier than mapping the bidirectional relationship, which hopefully is kind of more or less understandable, because when you have a bidirectional relationship, there's more paths that you can go across. You can go from one side to the other, or the other side to the first side, and obviously there's going to be more coding that's involved there. So let's focus right now on the unidirectional relationship for the relationship that we're talking about right now, which is the one-to-many relationship. All right? A lot of words here that I'm saying, a lot of the same words. I'm getting tired of saying relationship. I can tell you that much right now. In any case, so let's dive into it. So how do we do this? How do we tell Hibernate that we want to create this mapping? Well, our first step, like I said, is to put into the appropriate object the reference to the other object. So in this case, since we're going to be talking about the unidirectional relationship, I'm going to be talking about the child class, which is the employees. Okay, so the employee object, singular, the employee object, which is the Java file that we have created already with the ID and the employee name fields in it. We also are going to add a third field, like I said, which is the employer field. So we're going to store the employer on the employee object. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's create that. So I'd say private employer with a capital E, and then give it the variable name of employer with a lowercase e, whatever, create my getter and setter for the employer field. Great, fantastic. So now we have 3 different fields for the employee object. But now we need to get fancy and put in our Hibernate stuff. So how do we do that? Well, obviously there's annotations. This whole tutorial that I'm doing on Hibernate has always come back to annotations, and that's exactly what we're going to be dealing with today. So what annotations are associated with this one-to-many relationship? Well, believe it or not, it's the at one-to-many, as well as at many-to-one. Okay, so you see that there's a difference between the two. It's important to understand the difference. One is one-to-many, the other is many-to-one. So it sort of has this implication of the direction built right into the annotation itself. So this is how you tell Hibernate which side of the relationship you're dealing with here. Okay, so since we are dealing with the employee object, if you think about the relationship that we've mapped already, one-to-many, I've said one is the employer and many is the employee. So since we are inside of the employee object, okay, which way would we say it if we were going from the employee to the employer? We're going from the child to the parent, which means we're going from the many side of the relationship to the one side of the relationship, many to one. Therefore, we are going to use the at many to one annotation to map our relationship. All right, hopefully that makes sense. We're using many to one because that is currently what we're dealing with here. The child class, which is the employees class, or so I should say employee class, is the many side of the relationship. So we're using many to one. So where do we put this annotation? Well, it's a method level annotation. It's not a class level, okay? Because obviously when you're talking about relationships, we can have multiple relationships with that, point to multiple different objects within the same singular object. So that's why it's a method level annotation, not a class level annotation. So since it's a method level, we ask ourselves, well, where the heck should we put it? Well, like I've said with all the other annotations that are method level inside of the Hibernate framework when we're dealing with these objects, we always put them on the getter method, all right? So the same rule applies here. We're going to put it on the getter method of, hopefully you can guess it, the employer getter method, okay? Because this relationship applies to the employer. So that's exactly where we're going to put our annotation. So since we have declared our employer field and we've created our getter and setter, so get employer and set employer, we're going to take this at many-to-one annotation and we're going to embed it inside of the get employer annotation. So let me just flip over to my code and make sure I know exactly what I'm talking about here as I'm talking about it. Let me expand this. So I've created an employer class, employee class. So I'm going to the employee class, and sure enough, I have my private employer field. And if I scroll down to my get employer method, I have correctly put in my at many-to-one annotation. All right, fantastic. So because I've done that, there's one more thing that I want to do, and it's to assign something called a cascade inside of it. I actually didn't really talk about cascading much when I was talking about databases before, but cascading is actually a pretty important topic when we are dealing with relationships specifically. Okay, that's why there's no coincidence that the term cascade is appearing inside of the relationship annotation, which is the at many-to-one annotation. So we also want to specify, typically you want to have it cascade in all aspects. So what a cascade means is, and you'll see it in the code once it's running and doing its thing, what cascade means is as soon as we try to save our employee, so as soon as we create an employee object and we set an employer inside of it and execute a save to insert it into our database, Hibernate will realize that we want to cascade this particular relationship, and it will see that since we're trying to save the employee object and we haven't yet created an entry for the employer yet, because let's say we're in a brand new database scenario, it will see that we need to create the employer, and it will go ahead and create the employer on our behalf because we have said that we want to cascade this relationship. Okay, so the cascading works for insertions. So if the appropriate insertion has not taken place yet, it will cascade and it will insert for us, as well as deletions. If you're deleting a particular entry, like let's say we're deleting the employer. Okay, so the employer is on the one side of the one-to-many relationship. if we delete an employer, let's say a real world scenario is this particular employer is going bankrupt, so this company is going bankrupt. That goes without saying that if we're deleting it or it's going bankrupt, there should be no more employees. So when we delete the entry for the employer, we should also delete all of the employees from our database, right? That's called a cascade. It's a cascading delete. Okay, so that's the idea behind what a cascade is. It will automatically trigger more database operations that sort of make sense on our behalf. Because if we were to delete the employer, but not delete all the employees that are related to that particular employer, then we would be in a situation where we would have orphaned rows. Okay, so the employer is gone, but the employees map back to an employer that doesn't exist. So those particular rows are orphaned, and that's usually bad data. Okay, you usually don't want to be in that situation, so usually you want to delete all of those rows. All right, so that's the idea of what a cascade is. But let's get back on topic when we're talking about this relationship that we're creating. So we create it with, like I said, the @ManytoOne annotation. And we're creating it with the @ManytoOne annotation because that's the child side of the relationship, and we're only specifying the child side of the relationship because this is going to be a unidirectional relationship. So because it's a unidirectional relationship, we are only going to talk about and assign the relationship on one side. And we do that by putting in the employer object into the employee object and assigning our Hibernate relationship annotation to that particular method in our employee class. All right, again, I'm kind of going in circles here, saying the same thing over and over. I apologize if that's getting annoying. So, okay, we've created the @ManytoOne relationship. So now how do we, and so I should say, that's it. We're done. That's it for our unidirectional one-to-many / many-to-one relationship. We're done. We've done everything we need to do. So now how do we test it? Well, there's actually a few ways, or I should say 2 main ways to test this particular relationship thing that we have going on. The first way is actually, I haven't mentioned this at all, and I probably should have at the beginning of this talk, but Hibernate can exist on its own. Hibernate, the framework, can exist on its own, and what that means is you don't need to tie it in with Spring. Okay, what we have done in the talks that I've already given, you can, what we have done and I've given in the talks is that we have already integrated it in with the Spring framework. Okay, so because it's integrated with the Spring framework, that means that we're going to need to create controllers, and we're going to have all the code execution go through these controllers and DAOs and all that stuff. All right. But the other way that we can do it is we can have Hibernate all by itself. So you can actually go and create just a plain old simple Java project and import the appropriate Hibernate library files, and then actually create just a main method. So you can have a public static void main method, which is what we talked about ages ago when we first got started with Java programming. So you can have a basic old, Java application which runs off of a main method, and you can go through all the lines of code that you need to sort of get Hibernate up and running and instantiated and working correctly just through the main method. And then you can do all these operations on the relationships to test them and to see if they work inside of the main method. So I just want to sort of clear the air there and let you know that it is possible for you to just use Hibernate all by itself. But my method of teaching and the way I go about teaching you things is to sort of stray away from the things that aren't useful. Okay, it's one of the reasons why I don't really teach a lot about Java GUI stuff like Swing or AWT packages, is because they don't really they're not really heavily used in the professional field. You're not going to get a whole lot out of it by learning that stuff. Okay, which is why I was focusing on teaching the Spring framework, as well as I'm going to be teaching HTML, JSPs, all that stuff, because that's what's used in the real world. I should say it's very popular. And so they'll give you the best chance if you want to use this knowledge to actually get a job. That's the best way and the best chance that you'll have is to learn the stuff that I'm teaching you. So the same sort of rules go and apply to what I'm teaching you here. I'm not teaching you how to use Hibernate through the runnable Java method, the the public static void main method. I'm not teaching you to use it in that regard, because that's generally not how it's used in the real world. generally Hibernate, the persistence framework, is tied in with another kind of framework like Spring, which gives you like a web application feel, a look and feel to it, right? So generally you use a Hibernate, you use a database in turn and in corresponding, or what's the word I'm looking for, in tandem with some sort of web application framework like Spring or Struts or what have you. So that's why I'm teaching you how to use Hibernate in tandem with Spring, because that's, again, how it's used in the real world most commonly, okay? Most popularly, if that's a word. So, fantastic. Let's get back on track. So, having said that, unfortunately, because we are, talking about this in tandem with Spring, there's a few files and a few things that you need to make sure that you get up and running before you can really test this relationship, this many-to-one relationship that we just created inside of the employee object. So what that means is you're going to have to create an employee DAO. Okay, and we talked a little bit about DAOs already in the last episode. I was focusing on the address book thing, but now I've kind of switched to talk about employees and employers. So we'll probably have to create an employee DAO object, which I can and will put in the show notes for this particular episode, which will be at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session, 52, 53? What are we in right now? 53. So it'll be howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 53. So that employee DAO object is going to be just a standard DAO. We have seen this before. In the last episode I talked about this, but what we'll do is we'll just create a public class employee DAO, annotate it with the @transactional and @repository annotations, because this is going to be, like I said, a data access object, so those are mandatory. We'll auto-wire in the session factory, and we will create a save method which will take the employee object, because it's the employee DAO, so we'll be saving the employee object. And inside the save method, we will retrieve the current session, and then we'll just invoke a session.save on the employee object, thus obviously saving the employee object into our database. Now, the interesting part here, the interesting thing that's going on with this code, is that Hibernate will figure out the relationship for you. So because we're saving this as a unidirectional relationship, and we are invoking the save on the child object, when we actually invoke this save method, what will happen is, well, I don't want to get into what will happen before I talk about the actual code, but you'll see what will happen is actually quite nice. It does this cascading save thing that we actually set up to say to have it work inside of the @ManytoOne annotation. We put in our cascade all, which says to do the cascade, perform a cascade operation on all of the regular database operations. So basically now, okay, so we create the employee DAO object, great, but now we need to actually invoke the employee DAO's save method. So where are we going to do that? Well, what I've done is you can actually do it in two ways now that I think about it. Can you do it in two ways? Maybe no. Maybe not, because I was going to say you can maybe do it inside of a JUnit test, but I think the JUnit test doesn't properly instantiate all of the Spring Framework stuff and all the Hibernate Framework stuff. So unfortunately, you can't do it that way. So you actually do need to do it via something like a controller. So what I've done is I just created my own controller, and I mean, this is good practice for you guys, because you need to know how to be able to be comfortable with creating controllers and DAOs and all that stuff. So it's good practice. So I've created just a regular old controller. I call it the home controller for no apparent reason. I call it the home controller. I wire in through the @AutoWired annotation the employee DAO object. Okay, so I'm going to auto-wire that guy in, and I'm just going to change some code on my own screen because I made a typo and I don't want to upload that typo to the show notes. There we go. So auto-wiring in the employee DAO. And then what I've done is I've just created a test method. So I created a test method that will have a request mapping mapped to it with the test URI. So if you just go to this particular project that I've created, you go to localhost 8080, like I've shown you in videos and stuff like that in tutorials in the past. You go to your localhost 8080 / the name of the project, which in this case it's example project is what I have left over from the last time I created this project. So I go to localhost 8080 / example project / test, because that's the request mapping URI that I've put into the, like I said, request mapping annotation. And when it goes there, it executes some code. So this is where the magic starts to happen. This is the final piece in the puzzle for creating this unidirectional relationship with the ManytoOne annotation. So what we're doing here is we want to be in a situation where we're saving a couple of employees into the appropriate table with an employer as well. So what I've done is I've created both, like I said, the employer and the employee class. I've talked about how we have set those up. These are actual entity objects. So I've annotated them with the @entity annotation. So they will have their own tables created with their own primary keys, etc., etc. Again, everything that we've already talked about before. Nothing new is going on here. So I'm going to actually create these objects now inside of this test method that I'm using inside of my controller. So I'm going to when someone actually navigates to this particular URI, the test URI, it's going to execute this particular code. So the code that's going to execute is I'm going to create and instantiate a new employer object. So I'm going to say employer, and I'm going to give it the name. I'm going to call it employer. So employer with a capital E, employer with lowercase e, equals new employer with a capital E. So that will instantiate a new employer. Great. And then I'm going to set an employer name, and I'm just going to call it, whatever company name I want to put into this particular employer name. You can call it whatever you like, Google, Yahoo, who knows, mom and pop shop, or employer one if you want to be very uncreative. You set that employer name. Okay, beautiful, done. So we've created our employer. Now we want to create our employees. So we instantiate two. You can instantiate more than two, or you can instantiate just one if you really like. But I did two. So I did two employee objects. So employee one equals new employee. Okay. And then I'm going to set the employee one's name to be, let's say, Trevor Page. And I'm also going to set the employer of this employee. So I'm going to say employee one dot set employer, because I want to set the employer for this particular employee, which is going to be a reference to the employer object, the variable name that I've already created previously. Because remember, I created that employer. Like I said, you can call it Google or Yahoo or whatever you like. I'm going to take that variable name and input it into this particular setter method for the set employer. Okay, that way I'm sort of tying this Trevor Page employee with an employer. Okay, then I'm going to create employee 2 via the new employee syntax, which is, again, nothing new. I'm going to say employee 2 dot set name to be whatever, John Doe. And I'm going to say employee 2 dot set employer again, and I'm going to set it to the same employer as before. So I've set the employer being the same employer into two different employee objects. So both of the employee objects should point to the same employer. See what I mean? This is all in Java land, Java code, but we're kind of replicating exactly what we want to see in the database in our Java code. And then all I do is I invoke the save method on the employee DAO and pass in employee number 1 and employee number 2. Okay, so I say employee DAO.save employee 1, and I say employee DAO.save employee 2. So through the magic of Hibernate will go and say, okay, employee 1 is Trevor Page, and he works for employer 1. Okay, let's say we call it employer 1. So I'm going to save this entry. So it goes, and since I'm telling it to save the employee, it will save Trevor Page into my database. It'll insert Trevor Page into the database. And then it sees that it needs to set Trevor Page to be employed by employer 1. But employer 1 does not yet exist in my database, because we're assuming we're starting with a blank database. So, okay, what do? Well, Hibernate, since we have mapped it to have the @ManytoOne annotation with a cascade in it, it will say, oh, I know what to do. I need to create this employer as well in the database and associate it to Trevor Page. So that's exactly what it will do. It'll go and it'll insert into the employer table, and it'll insert the employer number 1 into the employer table. And then it will set the appropriate relationship, which is a foreign key on the employee table, which is what we did with the @ManytoOne relationship. It's going to turn that into a foreign key and point it to the employer table. Okay, beautiful. And then I invoke the employee DAO.save again, the second time with employee number 2. This time it says, okay, I see that the employee number 2 doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to create John Doe in my database. And I see that he is going to be associated with employer number 1. And since employer 1 has already been created, I'm not going to try to insert it again. I'm just going to point the foreign key to that particular employer. And there you go. Done. Okay, we have now successfully implemented and demonstrated that it works, the unidirectional one-to-many relationship inside of Java with our Hibernate and Spring frameworks. Very, very cool stuff. All right, now I don't know if I have enough time. I'm going to hit pause on the conversation for now. I think that's enough information. In the next episode, I'll talk about the bidirectional relationship because there's a few extra things that you need to do. Like I said, there's more coding involved. Nothing extraordinary, nothing crazy, but obviously there's more coding that needs to take place. So I'll save that discussion for the next episode, because I think I've already hit your brains and racked your brains enough. So now you can go and you can create your own unidirectional one-to-many relationship yourself with your own and put it into your own Java project. Okay. Again, I'll put all the source code up online on the show notes at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session53. Cool. Now, before I leave, I had two questions that came in from listeners. Like I said, I love getting questions. I'm not sure if I put down the person's name. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they asked for me not to include their name, but I don't have it written down. But in any case, I guess the name doesn't really matter because they will know who they are when they hear this, that they asked these questions. So question number 1. The person asks, I need to send automatic mail on my customers and suppliers' birth date, which they registered. I am using a MySQL database as the backend. Any solution would be most helpful for me. So automatically sending emails on particular dates has 2 different aspects to it that you need to sort of weave into your coding. Okay, the first is something called a cron job, and actually I didn't do any prep work for these questions. I probably should have, because now I'm going to be typing things in while I talk about it. But I believe the Spring framework has some sort of a cron job functionality. Let me see if I can find it. It looks like it does. So if you were to go to the Spring docs, so the actual documentation for the Spring framework, I actually just typed into Google Spring Framework cron, and that's CRON. Type that in. The first hit is for the Spring 3.0 framework for task, execution, and scheduling. Okay, task, execution, and scheduling. So what they have is they have an actual scheduler type programming here that you can actually set up to actually run code at a specific point in time. So what the person who asked this question would be interested in knowing is you can actually set it to execute every day. So you can set up something called a cron job via the @scheduled annotation. Okay, there's a few rules around it. I don't want to get into the absolute nitty-gritty because there's a very nice tutorial on how to do it online. Like I said, through the documents, the Spring Framework documentation. Use the @scheduled annotation, and you can either set it up as a fixed delay, so you can have a fixed delay that executes, 24 hours or something like that after the web application starts. But probably the better one that you want to do is actually execute the cron job, which means you need to put some details for saying cron equals, and you set a little string that tells it when to run your specific cron job. So I would also look at cron jobs, again CRON, jobs, JOBS. Cron jobs, the actual notation that you need to use to successfully run a cron job every single day. Okay, you're going to be using a bunch of stars and **/24, etc., etc. In any case, you'll figure it out. It's not too complicated. And then what will happen is Spring will actually execute that particular method on a predictable timeline, so it can do it every day. So every day it can run this particular method, and inside of the method you can send an email to the people. So you run the method, you query the database. Okay, inside of your method, you query the database to see if any birthdays match up with today's date, and then if they do, then you send an email to that person. All right. Now, for sending an email, let's see. I can open up some of my own code. I'll give my give my own code a shot. There's a few different ways that you can do it. One way is to do, let me just type in Java Mail, because I think it's something to do with Java Mail. So Java Mail API, it looks like it's provided by Oracle. I believe this is the one that I used to use. Let me look for Java Mail examples. So it looks like there's something from Tutorials Point. Yeah, this is probably what will get the job done. So there's a post. If you go to Google and type in Java space, or actually all in word, Java Mail, all one word, example, you'll see from tutorialspoint.com, they have a tutorial on how to do this. You could send, it tells you how to send an actual email, and you'll have to use your own email host. So you're going to have to know how to set up, not set up, you're going to have to know the details of like your SMTP details and whatnot. So you're going to need to know your username, password, and the SMTP host information for your email. And you can send it from your own email. Okay. Again, I don't want to get into how to do that because that's sort of beyond the scope of the question. You can get that through some simple searching on how to find your SMTP information for your email service provider. Now, doing it that way, sometimes I found that the emails would land in the junk mail folder. So if you don't want that to happen, if you don't want your emails to end up in the junk mail folder, I would suggest using something like Mailgun. Okay, again, mail, M-A-I-L, gun, G-U-N, mailgun.com. They provide a great free service on how to integrate Java with this service that they use to email stuff out, and it will email it out in such a way that it most likely will not land in the junk mail folder. Okay, I will warn you though, Mailgun is a bit difficult to set up. You're going to have knowledge of how to tweak the actual what is it called, the settings in your actual domain. So you're gonna have to add some information to your actual domain when you're looking at your host file, or your a host or a record file, I believe, or I forget the actual terminology because I'm not really a networking type of guy. I'm more of a programming type of guy. So you'll have to learn about how to be able to change your actual sort of your hosting file or whatever it is that it's called through your domain provider. So you'll have to add some stuff for Mailgun to be able to authenticate it and to make it work properly. Okay, but there are obviously tutorials on how to do it with Mailgun. Okay, so that's kind of a one or the other solution. Either you use the Java API or Java Mail API that I was talking about, or you use Mailgun. Okay, one or the other, your choice. So, great question. That's kind of a long, convoluted answer, but that's definitely a common problem when you're dealing with actual real enterprise applications, right? You need to be able to send emails out, and you need to be able to run cron jobs. So there you go. Question number 2 is someone saying, I'm stuck. I don't know how to install Java in Windows 7 as well as Windows 8. Can you please tell me step by step how to install Java on the said above operating system? And that's an easy answer. Go to javavideotutorials.net. Okay, Java Video Tutorials. Oops, sorry, that's my phone going off. javavideotutorials.net has, if you scroll down to the first video, you'll be able to access a step-by-step video tutorial on how to install Java. So I show you how to install Java as well as the Spring Source tool suite and how to get up and running with it very, very quickly. I think it's like a 15 or 20 minute video, so you can be done and ready to rock. So you go to javavideotutorials.net, scroll down about probably halfway through the page. You'll be able to see the first video. It says video number 1, Java Tools. So you can click on it, and you'll be able to be off and running and learning how to install Java. All right? And it is specifically on Windows 7 and 8 that it'll work on, so no worries. Cool. As always, guys, it's a pleasure doing these things. I love to answer your questions. I love to get reviews. I love to read your reviews. I love every aspect of this stuff. It's an absolute passion of mine, and I'm so lucky and in a privileged position to be able to give these and deliver this value to you guys. I just love to do it. So if you love my stuff and you want to help me out, by all means, go over to howtoprogramwithjava.com. Check out the show notes at /session 53, and hop on my email list. If you go to the very top of the page, you'll see at the very top there's a way to either click on a sign up page for a webinar if I'm running a webinar, or to just put your email address in to get the top 7 free tools that every Java programmer uses on a daily basis. Okay, you can get that. It's easy, simple, one-page PDF. You sign up, give me your email address. That will really help me out. I'd love to be in touch with you guys, and that's the best and easiest way to do it, is to get on that email list. All right, sound good, guys? Sounds good. So until next time, in the next episode, we'll be diving a little bit more into, like I said, the one-to-many bidirectional relationship, and maybe even further, Alan would talk about things like the one-to-one unidirectional and bidirectional relationship if there's time. If not, then like I said, we're going to be keeping on with these tutorials in the future, and I can't wait until the next episode. So take care, have fun, happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.